Have you ever wanted to get into a Magic the Gathering format, but you sit down to build a deck and just instantly feel overwhelmed? Does the sheer number of cards ever give you analysis paralysis and make it feel impossible to choose where to even begin or what cards to add? Well, don't worry, I'm going to give you some techniques and tools you can use to demystify the deck building process and equip you with the knowledge and confidence you need to begin constructing decks in any format that you want to play. To get things started, let's break down the anatomy of a Magic deck. Every Magic deck has some combination of lands and spells. The number of each of these is going to vary from deck to deck, but every deck is going to have a combination of these things. Going a little deeper, different decks have different quantities of card types. They have different number of creatures, instants, sorceries, what have you. Going even deeper, we see that different decks have different quantities of mana values among their cards. Some decks like to stay lower to the ground and keep all of their spells around 2 or 3 mana. Some decks like to go for a little bit of a longer game, and most of their spells are around 5 or more mana. If we go even deeper into these decks, we start to notice that they have different numbers of cards that are meant to be kill spells, draw spells, counter spells, things like that. We can start to lay out patterns that we see in different decks and make note of them. Being able to identify the patterns in decks like this is important because it is the first tool we're going to use when constructing decks of our own. This is because we want to start looking at decks not as fully completed decks, but as templates that can be replicated and iterated on. Let's look at an actual practical example of what I'm talking about. So the first thing we need to do is find a deck that we want to replicate. This doesn't even need to be in the same format or even time period of the deck that you're ultimately wanting to create. So let's say I'm trying to build a deck in the current standard format, but I really like the Pioneer Spirits aggro deck from 4 years ago. I can use this Spirits deck as a template, a guide for the standard deck that I want to build today. I've put a link to the Spirits deck that we're going to be looking at down below, so feel free to click that if you want to follow along as we go. All right, there's a lot going on in the Spirits deck, so let's break it down in the way that we discussed earlier. First thing we notice is this deck has 22 lands and 38 spells. And of those 38 spells, all 38 of them are creatures. Looking even deeper, we see that this deck has a very low mana curve, with 8 1-mana spells, 19 2-mana spells, and 11 3-mana spells. If we look even closer at the creatures in this deck, we notice that all of them are serving different functions. Take, for example, Spectral Sailor. This is a 1-mana spirit creature, but it also has a 4-mana ability that draws us a card. So we could almost think of Spectral Sailor as not only a creature, but also a draw spell for the deck. We see 2 different Lords with Supreme Phantom and Empyrean Eagle. Lords are just creatures that give a static stat boost to creatures of a similar type. Selfless Spirit offers some protection for our other creatures. Watcher of the Spheres discounts all of the spells that we're trying to cast. Spell Queller acts as a creature and also something of a counter spell. And Nebelgast Herald helps to tap down our opponent's creatures and clear the way for our own. The point here is that even though this just looks like a pile of 38 creatures, it is actually closer to a toolbox full of a variety of different tools. And our job here is to take the toolbox and recreate it in the format and time period that we're wanting to brew a deck in. So to get started building this deck in standard, I think the most important creatures that we need to find analogs to are the 2 Lords. So we can easily find these by searching Scryfall for cards that are legal in standard and also contain the text, "You control, get +1/+1. This will find every standard legal card that has some variation of text similar to Spirits you control get +1/+1. Doing this search shows us there are only actually 47 cards in standard that fit the bill. So now we just need to look these over and find a couple that intersect in a way that we can build a deck around. We have a few options for this, but I'm personally drawn to Valley Questcaller and Mabel Heir to Cragflame, both of which give our mice +1/+1. All right, we've established a general direction. We're going to be taking our 2020 Pioneer Spirits list to create a 2024 Boros mice list. Let's dig in a little deeper. Supreme Phantom and Empyrean Eagle are the two lords in our Spirits deck, and Spirits is running 4 copies of each of these. So let's go ahead and run 4 copies of our two lords, Valley Quest Caller and Mabel, to match our template. Now we can start going card by card in the Spirits deck and seeing how we can replicate it in Standard. Starting off with Spectral Sailor, we know the properties of this card are it is a 1 mana creature that fits the type that we're trying to go for. It also has an activated ability that lets us draw a card. Another way of thinking about this creature is it is a 1 mana creature that also has other ways to pump mana into it. This is really important for later in the game, so if we draw it when we have a ton of mana, it's still impactful. So now we take a look at all of the 1 mana mice in Standard and see if we can find anything that fills a similar enough role to Spectral Sailor that we can fit it in our deck. And I think we have a great option here in the card Flowerfoot Swordmaster. This is a 1 mana mouse, so it fits our creature restrictions, but it also has Offspring, an ability where when we cast it, we can pay extra mana and we get an additional copy of it. This means that it's a 1 mana creature that we can pump more mana into when we draw it later in the game. This even has the added bonus of sometimes pumping up the rest of our mice, so it's perfect. Spectral Sailor is a 4 of in the Spirits deck, so let's add 4 of this card to our deck. Next up is Mausoleum Wanderer. It's 1 mana, it grows when we play other spirits, and it can interact with our opponent's spells. Unfortunately, there's nothing like this in Standard right now, but I think we can still replace it with some useful things that fit a similar function. For this, I want to use the card Cheeky House Mouse. It is a 1 mana creature with 2 power and 1 toughness, so it starts off a little bit stronger than the Mausoleum Wanderer, which I think makes up a little bit for the fact that it does not get bigger when we play other creatures like the Wanderer does. It also has the option to play the Adventure Sorcery half of the spell, Squeak By, which will pump up our creatures and also get them underneath our opponent's blockers. Since this card is not a perfect analog to Mausoleum Wanderer, let's put 3 of them in instead of 4. Now onto the 2-drops. The first creature from Spirits we're going to be looking at is Rattlechains. Rattlechains is extremely powerful because it is a 2 mana creature with flash, and it protects our other spirits. Now we don't have anything quite like this in Standard mice, but we can achieve a similar effect with the non-creature spell Crumb and Get It. This has the added value of being a pump spell when we need it to be, but can also protect our creatures just like Rattlechains does. This isn't a perfect replacement for Rattlechains, and the fact that it isn't a creature is a pretty big deal in our creature-based aggro deck, so we're only going to put 2 in instead of the 4 Rattlechains that Spirits has. Another way of looking at Rattlechains is it is a creature that interacts with our opponent's cards. So to supplement it further, let's also add 3 copies of Nettleguard. Nettleguard is a 2 mana mouse that has an ability where we can sacrifice it to destroy an artifact or enchantment. This is a narrower piece of interaction than Rattlechains, but it's better than nothing. Okay, moving down the line, we have Selfless Spirit, another creature who serves as a bit of a protection spell. Now we could potentially run more copies of Crumb and Get It, or even a card like Invasion of Gobekon, which could pump our creatures and also serve as a protection spell. But I'm just going to make a judgment call here and assume that it is more important for us to just have more mice than it is for us to recreate this protection effect. So I'm going to choose to replace Selfless Spirit with just a solid 2 mana mouse. For this, I'm going to go ahead and go with Emberheart Challenger. It has haste and prowess, but most importantly, whenever we target it with a spell or ability for the first time each turn, we get to exile a card off the top of our library that we can play that turn. This generates a ton of value for us, so we're going to go ahead and run 4 of these. Next on the list for spirits is Shacklegeist. This is a creature that lets us tap 2 untapped spirits we control to tap down one of our opponent's creatures. So we can think of it as a card that clears the way for our own creatures. I think a good replacement for this is Manifold Mouse. This card also has Offspring, so it has the added benefit of letting us pump more mana into it later in the game, but it can also give our other mice Double Strike or Trample. These are 2 abilities that are very good for getting damage across, and it triggers all of the Valiant abilities on each of our mice, so it's a win-win. Spirits runs 4 Shacklegeist, so we're going to run 4 Manifold Mice. Watcher of the Spheres is the last of the 2 mana creatures we will look at, and it's actually the only non-spirit creature in the deck. It does, however, discount the cost of every creature in the deck by 1, a very powerful effect in a deck like this. Fortunately, we actually have a really good replacement for this in Standard, with the card Raging Battle Mouse. Our Battle Mouse doesn't reduce the cost of all our spells quite as efficiently as Watcher does, but it does reduce the cost of the second spell we cast each turn by 1. And with a deck like this, where all of our cards are so cheap, we are likely to be casting 2 spells on a lot of our turns. Spirits runs 4 Watcher of the Spheres, so let's add 4 Raging Battle Mice to our deck. In the 3 drops for Spirits, we have Nebelgast Herald, a flash creature who can tap down an opponent's creature to clear the way for our own. We actually have a pretty direct replacement for this in Standard in the card Mouse Trapper. Mouse Trapper is also a flash creature who costs 3 mana, and whenever we target it with a spell or ability for the first time each turn, we tap a creature an opponent controls. The Herald is a 3 of in Spirits, so we'll run 3 of these in our deck as well. The final creature in the Spirits deck is maybe one of the most powerful ones, and that is Spell Queller. Spell Queller is basically a spirit and a counterspell all wrapped up in one. Now, of course, we don't have anything like this in Standard Boros Mice, so I think what we want to do here is just add a slightly higher mana value mouse who has a really powerful ability. This is where we can add in the card Whiskervale Forerunner. Whiskervale Forerunner is a 4 mana mouse creature, and when we target it with a spell or ability for the first time each turn, we get to look at cards off the top of our deck and put a creature with mana value 3 or less onto the battlefield. This is of course extremely powerful, as almost all the cards in our deck are creatures with mana value 3 or less. Unfortunately, Forerunner costs 4 mana, where Spell Queller costs 3, so we're just going to run 3 copies of it so our mana curve doesn't get too high. And just like that, we have replaced all of the spells from the Spirits deck of 4 years ago into a Standard deck of today. Let's just take a quick look at the mana and then we'll be done. So examining the mana, we see that the Spirits deck is running 10 dual lands that produce both of the colors that it needs, and 12 basic lands. Another important thing to note is every land in the deck can enter untapped if needed. Now, 4 of the dual lands in the Spirit deck are Hallowed Fountain, a shock land that comes in untapped if you take 2 damage. We don't have that in Standard, but we do have Battlefield Forge, an untapped red and white land that is free to tap for colorless, or we can pay 1 life to tap it for red or white. So let's add 4 of those into our deck. We can also add 4 Inspiring Vantages, which is a red-white land that comes in untapped as long as it's one of the first 3 lands that you play. And we also get to run 4 Cavern of Souls, an extremely powerful land that can tap for any color when we're casting our mice and also makes them uncounterable. Cavern of Souls is a huge improvement to the mana base over what Spirits had 4 years ago, so I feel good with us having 12 dual lands in our deck instead of 10 like what Spirits had. This leaves us with 10 spots for basic lands. Now, the Spirits deck ran twice as many islands as they did plains, but their deck was also predominantly blue spells, whereas our spell has a more even distribution of the colors within it. So let's go ahead and just add an even number of all of the basic lands. Another nice bonus to our mana base is that we can run copies of Rockface Village, a red land that pumps our mice and also gives them haste, and also Lupin Flower Village, a white land that can help us dig through our deck to find more mice. Let's run 2 of each of these, which leaves enough room for 3 mountains and 3 plains. And that's it, we've done it. No one would take a look at this Standard Boros mouse deck and immediately think, oh, this must be based on the Pioneer Spirits deck from 4 years ago. But it is, because we used that deck as a template for this deck. This process can be replicated for all sorts of decks. Combo decks, control decks, mid-range decks, commander decks. Whatever you want to play, you can use this process for. Just find the deck that you want to replicate, find cards that are legal in your format or in your colors if it's a commander deck, and just build it based off the template you're using. And then as you play the deck more and more, you might find cards that don't fit as well in the current time or format that you're playing in, and that might encourage you to make some changes. You then get to start iterating on your deck and watching it evolve as it becomes a perfect fit for the time and format that you are playing in. And who knows, maybe someone will eventually use the deck that you end up constructing as a template for their own deck. Well, that's it for this video. I hope you feel more equipped to begin your deck brewing journey. Thank you very much for watching, and huge shout out to all of my supporters on Patreon. You can find a link down to that below. Everyone on Patreon gets early access to these videos, and their support means a whole lot. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, comment, subscribe. All of these things help a ton, and I really appreciate it. If you end up using this method to brew any decks of your own, please share them with me, either by leaving them down below or posting them on Twitter and tagging me in it. Anything. I want to see the decks that you brew. All right, that's it. Bye. LOL, lots of love.